Good morning. Now, Mr. McClelland is leading evidence this morning, and I think we have Mr. Baxter as our first witness. Right. Mary, do you know if it's both? Good morning, Mr. Baxter. As you're aware, Mr. Baxter, you're shortly going to be asked some questions by Ms. McClelland, who is sitting across from you. First of all, will you take the oath?
Yes.
Could I ask you, just sitting where you are, raise your right hand and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baxter. As you can see, you have a microphone in front of you. It seems to be fairly directional, so you might want to bear that in mind, and maybe just speaking just a little louder than you would in normal conversation. I have to say that I'm hard of hearing, and therefore very much appreciate that. We will plan to take a break about 11:30 for coffee. But if, for whatever reason, or no reason at all, just if you would wish to take a break during your evidence at some other time, give me an indication and we will break.
Thank you.
Right. Mr. McClelland.
Thank you, my lord. Could you please confirm your name?
Michael Baxter.
And Mr. Baxter, you have, I think, provided a statement to the inquiry, is that correct?
I have.
For everybody else's benefit, that's in the witness statement bundle, pages 83 to 129. Now, Mr. Baxter, the contents of that statement will form part of your evidence to this inquiry, and I'm going to ask you questions around the same subject area. But if you want to refer to your statement in the course of that, then please do say so.
Thank you.
What's your profession?
I'm a qualified accountant.
And what professional qualifications do you have?
I'm an accountant qualified through the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy.
And when did you gain that qualification?
1992.
Now, you say in your statement that between 2002 and 2014, you worked in the Health and Social Care Directorates of the Scottish Government.
That's correct.
And we'll come to that role in a moment. In 2014, you left, I think, to become the Director of Finance at Transport Scotland.
Yes,
correct?
December 2014, yes.
And what's your current job?
I'm currently Director of Finance and Corporate Services at Scottish Qualifications Authority.
So is it the case then that your involvement with healthcare administration and policy ended in 2014?
That's correct.
And is it also correct that your career has throughout been concerned with matters of finance broadly?
Yes.
And I don't mean this facetiously, you're not an engineer or an architect.
No, I'm not.
Can I just be clear at the outset that when I ask you about the operation of the Scottish Government Healthcare Directorates, I'm asking about the way they operated when you were in post, so up to 2014. They may, of course, have changed since then. If we return then to your role in the Health and Social Care Directorates, can I just check, first of all, is it directorates plural?
Yes, there were, and I think the number has changed subsequently, but there are a number of directorates that make up what used to be the government department, effectively.
Okay. I think you say in your statement that there are 13 directorates.
Yes, that's correct.
And do we take it then that those 13 directorates together are responsible within the Scottish Government for the NHS in Scotland?
That's correct.
And your role was in which one of those 13 directorates?
So I was based in health finance and information. At the time, there were a number of name changes whilst I was in in the health department, if you like, but health, finance and information was probably the kind of key one whilst I was there.
Okay. And just going by the title of that directorate, presumably it was responsible for matters of financial administration of the NHS in Scotland.
That's correct, both revenue and capital.
And just very briefly, just to help us orientate ourselves, what sort of issues are handled by some of the other 12 directorates?
So primary care, NHS workforce, I'm trying to think, clinical specialisms, so the Chief Medical Officer's office, Chief Nursing Officer, so matters of clinical oversight, and health finance also had a role in terms of performance management as well, and the financial performance of the health service.
Thank you. Now, in the 12 years that you had in the Health Finance Directorate, I think you say in your statement you had 2 roles.
That's correct.
First of all, 2002 to 2009, you were the head of its private finance and capital unit.
That's correct.
Is that a unit within the Health Finance Directorate?
Yes, it is.
And what in broad terms were your responsibilities in that role?
2 primarily, so oversight, planning and oversight of the capital budget for the NHS in Scotland, and in relation to private finance policy as it impacted on the health service in Scotland.
So if it came to the development and construction of new hospitals, did that fall within the scope of your remit?
In part, in that former role, I was a member of the Capital Investment Group, but in terms of the financial planning of investment decisions in the NHS in Scotland, capital investment decisions, I would have a direct role in terms of the planning of that within the context of our overall budget and the financial control of that budget as programmes and projects progressed.
Okay, so we'll come to the Capital Investment Group again in a moment. The second role that you describe between 2009 and 2014, you were the Deputy Director for Capital Planning and Asset Management.
That's correct.
And again, was that a department within the Health Finance Directorate?
Yeah, just to explain, the Private Finance and Capital Unit was part of the function that I then took over as Deputy Director, so it was all located within the same area. Okay,
so this role from 2009, that a promotion over your
was.
Previous role? And was the scope of the role similar, or was it different in any way?
It was broader in the sense that asset management more generally was part of the role. My previous role had been really focused on finance and private finance. This role was broader in terms of asset management and property related matters within the health service.
And in that second role, were you still responsible for the Scottish Government's part in the financing of new hospitals?
Yes.
Now, I think I'm right in saying that over both of those posts, so from 2002 to 2014, you sat on a body called the Capital Investment Group.
That's correct.
And from 2009 to 2014, you were its chair.
That's also correct.
What was the Capital Investment Group?
So the Capital Investment Group was a representative group from within Scottish Government Health and Social Care Directorates that assessed proposals coming through from NHS boards for investment decisions, whether that be new hospitals, health centres, above the delegated limits that the NHS boards have. Explain in my statement that boards had a certain level of delegated authority and responsibility based on the financial size of projects, and anything over and above that delegated limit required approval from the Scottish Government, and the CIG, or Capital Investment Group, was the vehicle through which that assessment was done.
Okay, thank you. We'll go over some of that again. The Capital Investment Group, that was a body within the Scottish Government.
That's correct.
And more particularly within the the Health and Social Care Directorate.
That's correct.
Yep. And was it made up of representatives from those different healthcare directorates?
Yes, it was.
Approximately how many people made up the CIG?
There would have been probably about 10 to 12. The attendees of the capital investment group, so the representation on CIG covered the whole of the health and social care directorates at the time. Those that attended the CIG would depend on the subject matter of the business cases that were being considered. So if there were specialisms involved, then some would have more of an input at particular times than others.
I mean, just going by the numbers, if there were 10 to 12 on the CIG, but there were 13 directorates, was it not quite as simple as there being somebody from each of the health and social care directorates?
I think, sorry, all directorates would have been represented. Whether they all attended or not is a different matter. Apologies, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now, in your statement, you set out in some detail responsibilities in that role. So paragraphs 3 and 4 of your statement. The page references are 83 and 84. We could start on page 83, paragraph 3. You have that, Mr. Baxter?
I do indeed.
You say here that during the period of my tenure as Deputy Director, I chaired the Scottish Government Capital Investment Group, and in that role I had responsibility for the Scottish Government's infrastructure investment policy for the area of health and social care. That role included, and then you set out a number of bullet points. Some of these are more relevant for our purposes today than others, so I'll just focus on those. First of all, the first bullet, you say there, allocating and managing the capital resources made available to NHS Scotland to invest in modern fit-for-purpose assets. And over the page, oversight of business case and approval processes and monitoring the delivery of major investment projects developed by NHS Scotland boards, time and cost. Then a few down, supporting the efficient delivery of capital investment through the development and implementation of effective and efficient procurement approaches. Then 2 more down, providing advice, supporting the development and delivery of major capital projects, including those being developed through private finance, such as non-profit distributing model, NPD, Scottish derivative of public-private partnership. Are those all elements of the role that you had on the Capital Investment Group?
Yes, those would have been functions that I would have been representing, if you like, on Capital Investment Group. I would have been supported in that also by some of my staff within the division, particularly on finance, and a colleague who I refer to in my statement, Norman Kinnear, who was the major capital projects advisor, PPP facilitator at the time, would have also provided input and advice. So it wasn't solely myself, but there was additional representation.
No, okay, thank you. So one understands that you had a senior role within the department and a team of people who would support you in the performance of those. Those bullet points that we've just looked at, do those give us a fair overview of your role in relation to new hospital provision in the Scottish NHS?
I would say so, yes.
So in addition to your financial background and expertise, what sort of expertise did other members of the Capital Investment Group bring to it?
So a range of things. So in terms of programme project delivery, again, refer to my colleague Norman Kinnear, who was originally brought in from the NHS and had experience in terms of the delivery of projects. We had clinical input, we had analytical input in terms of the option appraisals that were done as part of the business cases. We had representation from finance, because the implications of these projects weren't simply about capital but about revenue cost. And we would have had representation from performance management, who had an overview of the performance of NHS boards and you know, their operation. There were a number of officers in government that had that responsibility, and their responsibilities were split on geographic basis, east and west. We also would have had representation from the Chief Medical Officer Office and Chief Nursing Officer, depending on the nature of the proposals coming forward. So there was a very wide-ranging degree of input, and the idea was to have a holistic view on business cases rather than simply concentrating on the finance. It was about what the services that were to be the services that were to be provided from these facilities.
Okay, thank you. To what extent was there engineering or architectural expertise on the capital investment group?
There wasn't any.
So if a health board in Scotland decided it wanted to build a new hospital, is the approval of the Scottish Government required?
If it's in excess of their delegated limit, which at the time would have been between 5 and 10 million, then yes.
So if we're talking about a major hospital on the scale of the new Sick Kids Hospital, that Scottish Government approval would be required?
Absolutely, yes.
And for a project of that scale, specifically, whose approval was needed?
So my statement highlights that there were graduated levels of delegated authority, and for a hospital of that size, then the Director General approval would have been required.
And on what basis would the Director General decide whether or not to grant approval?
So it would be based on advice through the Capital Investment Group. I think it's important to say that before the Capital Investment Group would consider a business case, it needed to be approved by the relevant NHS board. So there would have been governance applied at a local level before Capital Investment Group would have considered the case. And that assurance was an important part of our overall consideration of the business cases within government.
Yes, so just to go back over that, the business case wouldn't arrive with you on the CIG until it had been approved, first of all, by the board of the relevant
That's correct.
health board. And what is the role of the CIG in a case where the Director General's approval is required?
It's about providing advice to the Director General that the conditions of the Capital Investment Manual have effectively been complied with. The assessment that would have been undertaken on the business case, there would have been input from clinical colleagues, performance colleagues around the alignment of the business case with the clinical strategy for the relevant board, or if it was a regional or national service boards. So all of that would have been taken into account in the consideration by the Capital Investment Group at the time.
And in a case like that, where the Director General's approval is needed, was the outcome of the Capital Investment Group's consideration a recommendation to him or her whether or not to grant approval?
Yeah, yes.
Can a health board proceed to build a hospital without the approval of the CIG?
Not if it's outside its delegated limit.
And is Scottish Government approval needed whether the hospital is to be funded by public capital or by private finance?
Yes.
So did NHS Lothian require and obtain the approval of the Scottish Government and the CIG to build the RHCYP DCN?
So in terms of my tenure, at the point that I left Scottish Government Health and Social Care Directorates, there were still a number of outstanding matters that required conclusion before the full business case was signed off. And I honestly can't comment on what happened after that in terms of the closeout of those issues, but I would have expected that any outstanding issues would have been closed off before approval was given.
Okay, thank you. Of course, one perfectly understands that if there were events after you left, you wouldn't know. And can I just say, instead of using that long acronym of RHCYP DCN, I think I'm going to say something like sick kids instead, just so we can all be clear that that's what I mean when I say that.
That's understood, thank you.
You referred in your statement, and I think a moment ago, to the Scottish Public Finance Manual and the Scottish Capital Investment Manual. Briefly, what is the Scottish Public Finance Manual?
The Scottish Public Finance Manual is the guidance that which is applied across the public sector in Scotland. It sets out the kind of governing rules, if you like, in terms of how finance is to be operated within the public sector.
And who issues it?
It's the Scottish Government that issues it.
And who are the intended addressees?
So it would be Scottish Government departments, directorates, and public bodies. So non-departmental public bodies, NHS boards. It would apply to central government functions, essentially.
And so for our purposes, we can regard the Scottish Public Finance Manual as having been issued by the Scottish ministers to be followed by NHS Lothian in relation to its spending of public funds.
Yes, and I should add that within each sector of health, for example, there may be supplementary guidance that provides more specific direction to bodies.
Okay.
And the scheme would be an example of that.
Thank you. That leads us neatly on. You referred to the SCIM. Is that short acronym for the Scottish Capital Investment Manual?
It is.
And what is the SCIM?
So the SCIM provides a framework for the development of investment proposals. It covers the development of the business cases, it covers procurement, it covers management of construction projects, and it also covers things like post-project evaluation. So it's supposed to be, or meant to be, an end-to-end set of guidance in terms of how you go about developing and delivering capital programs or projects.
Is the SCIM specific to NHS
It is.
projects? You referred there to one of the things covered by the SCIM as being the development of business cases.
Yes.
Could you perhaps just give us an outline of the stages for development of a business case?
At the time that I was involved in this, there were 3 stages effectively. The first one was what was called an initial agreement, and that set out the kind of strategic case. What was the problem or problems that were aimed to be resolved by a proposal? At that point, it didn't necessarily follow that it was a new building. It could have been a clinical issue that there might have been a workforce solution to it rather than a physical one. But the initial agreement basically set out what the problem statement was, what the long list of options that could be considered were, and to then identify a short list of options to be explored further at the next stage.
And who was responsible for producing the initial agreement?
The NHS board or boards concerned.
And is the initial agreement something that would have to be approved by the CIG?
Yes, it would.
Assuming one was beyond the delegated limits of the Health
Yes,
Boards
it would.
Authority. What's the stage after the initial agreement stage? So
the next stage is what's referred to as the outline business case, or OBC. And what that does is it further develops the work and reaffirms the work that was done in the initial agreement. It identifies the short list of options that have been identified to resolve whatever the issue is, and the option appraisal. So that's the consideration of cost, risk, benefit, is undertaken at that stage to identify the preferred option.
And in a case where the business case requires the approval of the CIG, does one get to the outline business case stage without the approval of the CIG?
So an initial agreement would need to be agreed before the outline business case was prepared.
And what is the stage after the outline business case?
So following the outline business case, and this applies regardless of the funding mechanism, the project, the preferred option would then be procured, and following that procurement, or at the final stages of that procurement, a full business case would be prepared, which basically set out what the deal on the table was, in terms of cost, in terms of delivery, but also a reaffirmation that the objectives that were set out in the outline business case are going to be delivered. So that's the kind of the deal on the table, as I would describe it.
And again, is the approval of the CIG required to move from the outline business case into the procurement phase and then to the completion of the full business case? So the movement from the outline business case to procurement, yes, an outline business case would require to be approved before procurement started. In the case of in terms of private finance, there was a supplementary key stage review undertaken by the Scottish Futures Trust prior to a procurement exercise being conducted, and that was about the readiness of the NHS board to commence that procurement. Okay, we'll leave the key stage review processes for now. Sorry, I should add that in the case of private finance, there is a fourth stage, and that's what's called a full business case addendum. And at the point at which a full business case is approved, a health board would be in the latter stages of that are submitted. It would be in the final stages of that procurement exercise. There are certain provisions within a private finance arrangement that can't be resolved until the day that the deal is done. So the actual cost of debt, etc. So we had added a full business case addendum, which reflected the deal that was signed, taking into account those conditions. So if we just go back over that, is that essentially a splitting what was a one-stage process of approving the full business case into a two-stage process to accommodate the particular commercial features of a private finance project? That's correct. And the addendum would only deal really with the movement from the assumptions in the full business case. Okay. And the point of splitting that into two elements, is that so that the Capital Investment Group and the Scottish Government would have the ability to give its approval to each of those stages? So the full business case would set out parameters on which the deal was going to be done. So there was a degree of flexibility in terms of movement in the cost of debt, for example, that would be assumed. The purpose of the full business case addendum, which is effectively retrospective, was really about concluding an audit trail around what the final cost of the deal would be. And just to pick up one point that you made there, if one takes that business case approval process from initial agreement through to full business case, the procurement of the contracts comes after approval of the outline business case and feeds into the full business case. Correct. Now, after that slight diversion, I would just like to return to the matter of the Scottish Public Finance Manual and the Scottish Capital Investment Manual. Do those two documents have relevance to the business case approval process we've just been discussing? Yes. And what's their relevance to that process? So the Scottish Public Finance Manual sets out in relation to major investment projects what the obligations on government departments and public bodies are in very, very general terms. And the scheme, it then sets out the processes that, including those within the Capital Investment Group, it sets out what the requirements are for NHS boards or bodies that are taking forward proposals. So do we understand from that that the detailed guidance about business cases for the approval of hospital projects would be found by a health board in the scheme? That's correct. And I think somewhere in the statement, you describe the SPFM and the scheme as guidance. If a request for funding approval by a health board did not comply with those documents, how would that affect its prospects of obtaining the Scottish Government's approval?
So I think there are a couple of things to say on that. One, if it was at the initial agreement stage and there was an issue with the original proposal, then if that was rejected, then the potential is that it wouldn't proceed to the next stage. If the issues had arisen at a later stage, so an outline business case, for example, there would have been interaction with the relevant NHS board in terms of trying to resolve whatever issues there were around the business case process or around the business case itself, given that there'd already been a commitment to, the need to resolve a particular issue at the initial agreement stage.
So I think it was implicit in your answer that health boards would be expected to comply with the terms of these documents.
Absolutely.
And would be unlikely to get approval if they didn't.
Correct.
And I think you also described there a process of dialogue, really, between the Capital Investment Group and the health board to ensure that the requirements of those manuals were met.
Yes.
Could we have up a document? It's a document from Bundle 3, Volume 2, and at page 120. Now, since it's the first document we've gone to, can I just check that everybody who needs it has it? Do you have it in front of you, Mr. Baxter?
Just the title page on screen.
Okay. Lord Brody.
I have it in hard copy.
Good. We see here on the front page, it's got the crest of the Scottish Government, and the title is Scottish Capital Investment Manual Business Case Guide. And the inquiry understands that this is the 2011 version. Are you, or at least were you, familiar with this guide?
Yes, I wrote most of it.
Oh.
So,
well, what is its purpose?
So the purpose is to, one, give an overview of the process. There are flow charts that set out the kind of end-to-end process, but it's also about, for each stage, setting out what the requirements are and hopefully providing helpful advice to NHS boards as to what they're required to do and to demonstrate.
Okay, so this is guidance to health boards.
Absolutely. Yeah.
On the business case process. If you could go to page 123, please. And just the opening paragraph there, I'll read that out. This is part of the foreword. NHS Scotland invests over £500 million each year on new or replacement assets such as land, buildings, equipment and facilities. With the increasing demand for infrastructure investment and recognising the lasting impact that such investment decisions have, it is essential that we make the right investment choices and that we clearly demonstrate and deliver value for money to the taxpayer. Now, I appreciate this is just one paragraph in a very long document, but does that give us a flavour of the purpose of the guide?
In terms of the overall scheme, yes, it does, yeah.
And further down that page, just in the bottom paragraph, just picking up from the last word on that page and reading from there, it says, additionally, an assessment of design quality at initial agreement, outline business case and full business case stages is now part of the Scottish Government Health Directorate's business case process, the purpose of which is to ensure that the outcomes of development projects meet the government's objectives and expectations for public investment. The aim of mapping design into the business case process is to support the implementation of the policy on design quality for NHS Scotland by improving the level of design quality achieved across NHS Scotland and ultimately the outcomes achieved by doing so. We see there a reference to government's objectives and expectations for public investment. Was it part of the purpose of the business case process to help achieve the government's hospital design policy objectives?
Following the issue of that edition of the scheme, then yes, it was, and part of the consideration in the drafting of that was to make sure that the policy on design quality, which was updated in 2010, that there was an alignment between the business case process and the design quality policy.
And if we just read on down that page, the second last paragraph, a good business case brings together the evidence to support an NHS board in their decision making and provides assurance to other stakeholders, including the public and Scottish ministers, around the basis for such decisions and the robustness of the evidence and processes that underpin such key decisions. So do we see there the expectation that the business case is gathering together evidence which will inform a decision about whether or not the government's policy objectives are being met?
Yes. I should add that I think in terms of the first sentence in that paragraph that you've quoted, that this was a basis for the NHS board also to get equivalent assurance, and therefore when it came to Scottish Government considering these, that had been through a governance and assurance process at board level, and to get that, and there was a reliance placed on some of that assurance that had been received.
Yes. So this, we could perhaps put it this way, this guide is communicating to health boards the expectations that the Scottish Government has of business cases submitted to it.
Yes.
Yeah. If we could move forward, please, to page 129 of the bundle. And I'm going to read from the bottom two paragraphs. Where it says that all projects submitted to the SGHD Capital Investment Group for approval are now subject to an assessment of design quality and functionality, including technical and sustainability standards. This design assessment will take place at the initial agreement, outline business case, and full business case stages of approval. We see there a reference to technical standards. What would you understand that to refer to?
So the NDAP or NHS design assessment process that was introduced sought to deal with a range of matters. So when we're talking about sustainability, there were clear objectives set out in the design quality policy around sustainability. There were design principles, or the importance of design in healthcare in terms of health outcomes was a major consideration, and also in terms of technical input as well. So that process that was introduced involved, as I said at the outset, I'm not an engineer and I'm not an architect, so it sought to involve those from Health Facility Scotland, Architecture and Design Scotland, and in the case of NPD projects from SFT, who did have knowledge in those areas. You're aware, I think, of the Scottish Health Technical Memoranda issued by Health Facilities Scotland? I'm aware of them, yes.
Is the reference in this paragraph to technical standards, would that include SHTMs?
My interpretation of that would be yes.
And also what we see in that paragraph is that the assessment of the design is to take place at those three separate stages of the business case approval process.
That's correct. I think it's important to say, though, that the design quality policy and the scheme were introduced and the revised scheme were introduced at a point in time. So there were a number of projects that were already well under development, including the original proposals around sick kids at the time. So there wasn't a suggestion of retrofitting or people having to go back to the start, given the stage of development that a number of schemes were at.
Yes, that's a fair point, and it's one that we'll return to. So just to get our chronology right, this document that we're looking at here is from 2011.
That's correct.
Yeah. If we could move forward, please, to page 141 of that document. We see there the heading, responsibility for producing the business case. This perhaps touches on a point that you made a moment ago, Mr. Baxter. Just reading the first paragraph, the ownership and responsibility for the infrastructure investment planning process rests with the NHS Scotland body developing or leading the development of the programme project in question. So in short, if a health board wants a new hospital, responsibility for the investment planning process rests with them.
That's absolutely correct.
So that's the responsibility of the health board. What's the responsibility of the Scottish Government and the CIG through this process?
I would say that the responsibility of government was twofold. One was ensuring that the proposals coming forward were in line with national policy in terms of the service provision within the NHS. Also that from a financial perspective, regardless of whether projects are capital funded or resource funded, that the funding for NHS boards comes from the Scottish Government. And therefore the planning of the funding requirements for NHS bodies was a responsibility for Scottish Government.
And
Sorry, it's entirely my fault. I'm not quite sure if I have picked up on the second aspect of the responsibility of Scottish Government. Ensuring proposals are in line with national policy, I followed that. And then you began from a financial perspective. Could you just repeat that?
Certainly. So the funding that's provided to NHS boards for the provision of services comes from the Scottish Government, including the funding for major capital investment proposals. So NHS boards receive two funding envelopes, a capital resource limit, which deals with their capital budget, and a revenue resource limit. The capital budget and the capital resource limit varies depending on the proposals that are coming through at any point in time. Therefore, the proposals that come through business cases help inform the scale and the timing of that funding requirement.
Right. I think I now understand the answer, because when I first heard the answer, I thought it was Scottish Government. You were simply saying that the Scottish Government had a responsibility to provide finance by whichever method. But the point I should take away is that the Scottish Government has a responsibility not only to provide the money, but to plan for timing and indicate any upper limits which might be appropriate.
Yes, for capital investment, more generally, we're talking about long lead-in times and long planning horizons for the delivery of programs and projects. At the time that the Sick Kids was being developed, obviously made reference in my statement to the financial crisis that appeared in 2008, 2009, and the impact that had. But regardless of that, you need to be planning on a 5-10 year cycle in terms of the development of projects and their delivery. And within an overall funding envelope, you're having to consider what's already legally committed or committed and what flexibility you then have to deal with new projects or programs coming forward. So the timing of this and these projects becomes really, really important in that regard.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. McLeod.
Obliged, my lord. So with Lord Brodie there, you were developing the financial aspect. I think you began by saying that one aspect of the CIG and the Scottish Government's responsibility was ensuring that proposals were in line with national policy.
Yeah.
How did the CIG do that?
So the proposals as set out in the business cases dealt with the kind of case for change, if you like, and what the requirement was or what the programme or project sought to deliver. And part of the CIG assessment would be their compliance or other, compliance isn't the right word, but their fit with national policy in the direction of travel. So the national strategy for the NHS in Scotland at the time, were the proposals compatible with those aims? And in terms of the board's own service plans and strategic plans, was there a fit with those?
Are you describing there a process in which the CIG's decision is based on the evidence presented by the Health Board in the business case?
That's correct.
To what extent is that compliance by health boards with policy and so on audited by the CIG? At a
global level, it's not an audit. I wouldn't describe it as an audit.
If I could put it this way, does the CIG look behind what the health board tells them?
Yes, and bearing in mind that members of the capital investment group engage with relevant NHS boards on a range of issues other than simply the business case proposals. So there is or certainly was a detailed knowledge of what was going on within NHS boards and what the service challenges were. There were the data that was being analysed on an ongoing basis in terms of service provision or population changes, growth, demand. All of these things, whilst they're represented in the business cases as part of the case for change, there would be ongoing discussion between the government and the relevant NHS board about these matters as a matter of course.
Okay, so would it be wrong then to see this process as one in which the health board presents information in a business case to the CIG, and that's the end of it? The CIG has wider knowledge from its work in.
There's additional context that certainly comes into the assessment of the business cases, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, you refer at several places in your statement to, and I think you maybe mentioned it a moment ago, to the Scottish Government policy on design quality in the NHS. Could we please have bundle 4, page 99?
Thank you.
Do you have that in front of you, Mr. Baxter?
Yes, I can see the title page of CL 19.
Okay, thank you. So we see there again the crest of the Scottish Government. At the top left, we see that the letter has been issued by the Health Finance Directorate.
That's correct.
And the date of the letter is the 2nd of June 2010.
Yes.
And if we move forward to page 101, do we see there your signature on the letter?
Yes.
So this was a letter you issued?
In my role as the Deputy Director, yes.
And if we see the addressees down the right-hand column, they include Chief Executives of NHS boards and the Director of Health Facilities Scotland. See that?
It's on page 100, yeah.
Sorry, page 99.
Oh, sorry. Yes?
Yeah.
See that.
Is this letter issuing the design policy that you were talking about a moment ago?
Yes, it is.
and it's headed up a policy on design quality for NHS Scotland 2010 revision.
Yep.
I think you explain in your statement that it's a revised version of a policy first issued in 2006.
That's correct.
Why was the policy revised?
Policies are subject to periodic review. There have been a number of developments in respect of design related matters in healthcare, and it was time to revise the guidance and the policy for NHS Scotland.
Was there any particular driver for the revision of this policy?
There were a number of things that were pertained at the time. The importance of the healthcare environment. There'd been considerable work done. I refer to a number of issues around single rooms, etc., in my statement, my witness statement. But environmental matters and the place of healthcare design within the wider sort of design realm, if you like, there'd been considerable engagement with Health Facilities Scotland from a technical perspective, but also in terms of Architecture and Design Scotland as well, in terms of the broader ambitions for design and the use and the importance of design of public buildings and the place that they had in the wider sort of social realm, if you like. So there were a number of factors that fed into this.
Okay, we'll perhaps pick up on some of those details as we go through the letter. So just from page 99, Mr. Baxter, I'm just going to read out parts of this. Paragraph number 1, this letter provides colleagues with a revised statement of the Scottish Government's policy on design quality for NHS Scotland, Annex A. So we see there that the policy statement itself is Annex A to the letter.
Yes.
Then paragraph 3, this CEL stands for Chief Executive Letter, I think.
Yes.
CEL and the attached policy statement supersedes NHS, and then there's a reference. This CEL also provides information on design assessment within the SGHD CIG business case process. And that was something that you touched upon a moment ago, I think.
Yes.
And then paragraph 5, we see the revised policy on design quality for NHS Scotland and associated mandatory requirements take immediate effect. And just to be clear, the date of that letter is the 2nd of June 2010. See that?
Yes.
And then reading on in paragraph 6, just over the page on page 100, we see support for the implementation of the design agenda will be provided by means of a coordinated tripartite working arrangement between Scottish Government Health Directorates, Health Facilities Scotland and Architecture and Design Scotland to facilitate the procurement of well-designed, sustainable healing environments which support the policies and objectives of NHS boards and the Scottish Government Health Directorates. Now, if we just pause there, it's about design quality, but this is being issued by the Finance Directorate. What interest did the Finance Directorate have in design?
So the Directorate, so the division for which I was responsible as the Deputy Director, was originally called Property and Capital Planning. And within the remit that I had, there were aspects around property within the NHS that were part of that responsibility. That previous policy, the 2006 policy, was issued from exactly the same part of government. So there wasn't a separate design directorate, if you like, within government. But my division at the time had responsibility for overall investment policy, including the design aspect of it. And we, as is indicated in paragraph 6 on page 100, we took advice on these matters from relevant parties, including HFS and Architecture and Design Scotland.
So, I mean, to put it in perhaps slightly colloquial terms, was that the interest of the Finance Department is simply in saying what it expects to get for expenditure that it approves.
I would say it's slightly wider than that in the sense of from a policy perspective, there was a recognition of the importance of high quality design and healthcare. I at the end of my tenure chaired what was called the European Health Property Network, which brought together representatives from around 13 European nations to discuss issues around healthcare design. Investment was one aspect of that, but equally there was input from architects and engineers. Health Facility Scotland were part of that network as well. So it was more of a holistic overview rather than a detailed expertise, if you like.
Okay. And you refer in that paragraph of your letter to a tripartite relationship amongst the Scottish Government, Health Facilities Scotland, and Architecture and Design Scotland.
Yep.
Who was to coordinate the tripartite relationship?
So essentially through Scottish Government Health Directorates, because the proposals effectively from the business cases from NHS boards or proposals from NHS boards were channeled through the Scottish Government effectively. So we would have a forward schedule, if you like, of anticipated proposals. Coming back to the point I made to Lord Brodie, that you had to plan in advance for what you expected to see coming forward. So we would work out with Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facility Scotland what the programme of new proposals would be over the next 12, 18 months in order that their input could be planned.
So the coordination of the tripartite relationship rested with the Scottish Government?
It was at our behest that it happened, yes.
Then in paragraph 10 on page 100, lower half of the page, the letter says that in order to meet the above objectives, Architecture and Design Scotland will deliver 3 main activities on behalf of SGHD. Then activity 2 is providing, in partnership with HFS, Health Facilities Scotland, a coordinated assessment of the potential quality of proposed projects to support those responsible for decision making within the business case process. Just pause there. When it refers to those responsible for decision making, who does that refer to?
So my understanding of that is it refers to both the NHS board and to the Scottish Government. So there would be ongoing engagement between Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland with the relevant NHS board in developing proposals in order to form their view, which would then be provided to the Scottish Government.
And specifically within the Scottish Government, would it be the CIG?
Yes.
Then reading on, this will involve contributing particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to government policy on design and placemaking to a process administered and led by HFS, who will, in addition to the administrative elements, provide particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to functionality, particularly technical and sustainability standards developed by HFS and the Department of Health in England. Reference there to technical standards, would you have understood that to include technical guidance such as Scottish Health Technical Memoranda?
Yes, I would.
Dealing with things such as ventilation in hospitals?
I can't comment specifically on ventilation, but as a general point, I would expect that to be the basis on which the assessment would be done. Okay,
and there's a description there of the role of HFS. Is that role for HFS a new development compared to the 2006 policy?
Yes, it is. So just to be clear, in terms of the design assessment process was new and therefore HFS's role had changed. In terms of the provision of advice on technical standards, that was unchanged.
Okay, so HFS always had, or at least since 2006, had an advisory role in relation to standards.
Correct, it wasn't a decision-making role. Yeah, absolutely.
But are you saying that one of the purposes of the 2010 revision was to give HFS a decision-making role in relation to guidance?
It wasn't a decision-making role. It was to make sure that we had a coordinated assessment of design, which took into account a wider range of facets, if you like, to inform the decisions that were being taken at a board level and then assessed by the Capital Investment Group.
Why was that new role for HFS introduced in 2010?
The requirements of the updated policy were certainly more fulsome, I think, and because of the various interests involved in this, it was important to bring together those parties that had expertise and insight in a more coordinated way than had been the case historically.
The phrase you used there was more fulsome. Would it be fair to say that the design standard expectations of the Scottish Government had become more demanding?
I think in terms of the mandatory requirements that are set out in the 2006 policy and the 2010 policy, those are broadly consistent. So I don't think it's about expectation, it's about making sure that those were delivered, if you like, and that we got assurance on those matters.
Okay, so the phrase that you used of more fulsome, was it beefing up the processes for making sure that the policy objectives were met?
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 11 of your letter at page 101, under the heading of Design Assessment and the Business Case Process, says that an assessment of design quality is now part of the SGHD business case process. All projects submitted to the SGHD Capital Investment Group for approval are now subject to an assessment of design quality and functionality, including technical and sustainability standards. This design assessment will take place at the initial agreement, outline business case, and full business case stages of approval. Is that describing what has been referred to in the statements as an NDAP?
Yes, that's my interpretation of it, yes.
And just to be clear, what do you understand NDAP to stand for?
It's NHS Scotland Design Assessment Process.
And so do we understand from paragraph 11 that this was a new process introduced with this policy revision in 2010?
Yes.
And we see that the NDAP is intended to take place at those 3 stages in the business case approval process.
That's correct. And the point that I made earlier in my evidence is that this was obviously introduced at a point in time, and the idea was not about retrofitting to projects that had already passed progressive stages.
You're quite right to raise that point, and don't worry, we will return to it. I will ask you some questions about that.
Okay.
And if we just move through that, the bundle to page 102, I think we see there the cover page of the policy document itself.
Yes.
And if we go to page 112, which is within that policy document, do we see there the list of mandatory requirements being imposed by this policy?
Yes.
I'm just going to read through some of those. First of all, the second one, it says that each NHS Scotland board must appoint a member of the NHS board to act as design champion at a strategic level to assist in articulating and promoting the board's design vision, and, where not impractical, also a senior officer to act as supporting design champion at a technical level with knowledge and experience in capital investment procedures and expertise in technical matters. Insofar as this relates to design champions and technical matters, what was your understanding of the reasons for this mandatory requirement?
So in terms of the board, so taking the first element, it was around the promotion at a strategic level around the importance of design. so that there was representation and focus at a board level. And the reference, I think, in terms of the senior officer, you know, at a technical level, was to make sure that that board member was supported by an appropriate officer who had relevant experience in such matters.
And in referring to technical level, would that encapsulate things such as the SHTMs?
I would expect that to be the case, yes.
And if we go to mandatory requirement 6, it reads, all NHS Scotland bodies engaged in the procurement of both new build and refurbishment of healthcare buildings must carry out independent environmental accreditation for projects. The Scottish Capital Investment Manual requires that all new builds above £2 million obtain a BREEAM Healthcare or equivalent excellent rating, and all refurbishments above £2 million obtain a very good rating. If the capital costs are, and so on, what was the purpose of a BREEAM rating?
BREEAM was the kind of industry standard for environmental impact of a facility, and really would set an objective that sought to make sure that those facilities that we were developing were designed to a high standard, that sustainability was absolutely considered in that, as well as the broader environmental impact in the the environment in which the healthcare facility was located. So it was a model that was applied in other parts of the UK as well, but it provided a consistent basis of assessment.
Would it be relevant, so far as you know within your area of expertise, would it be relevant to a BREEAM rating to consider the energy consumption of mechanical systems such as a ventilation system?
Yes, it would.
Was the requirement of a BREEAM rating a new requirement introduced with this policy?
My understanding is it was.
Well, the inquiry can check for itself against the 2006, but thank you. If we move on to mandatory requirement number 7, just reading from that, all NHS Scotland bodies engaged in the procurement of both new build and refurbishment of healthcare buildings must use and properly utilise the English Department of Health's Activity Database, ADB, as an appropriate tool for briefing, design and commissioning. If deemed inappropriate for a particular project and an alternative tool or approach is used, responsibility is placed on the NHS Scotland body to demonstrate that the alternative is of equal quality and value in its application. What do you understand by the activity database?
So the activity database was a means of essentially preparing room data sheets based on extant standards, and it had been developed in England. With regard to technical guidance standards, there was a number of fora that existed for Scotland to engage with the rest of the UK in terms of the development of guidance, but at the time that this was issued, the Department of Health had developed this guidance, and whilst there were some differences in terms of Scottish guidance, the CAL highlights, that they should apply the Scottish guidance, that the care should be taken to apply the Scottish guidance where that was appropriate. So it was a consistent means of briefing against standard.
Okay, well, perhaps it'd be helpful to look at a little bit of the guidance that lies behind the policy. But before we do that, just to be clear, this policy statement in 2010 made it a mandatory requirement for health boards to use the activity database in briefing for new hospitals.
I don't think it was a new requirement. Again, my recollection is that the 2006 policy also had it as a mandatory requirement.
Okay, thank you. If we could move forward, please, to page 136 of that document. Do we see there a section headed up Activity Database? You have that, Mr. Baxter?
It's on screen now, yes.
And just reading from that, Activity Database is the briefing, design and commissioning tool for both new build and refurbishment of healthcare buildings. Then just reading on, it is the complete tool for briefing and design of the healthcare environment. ADB is produced by the Department of Health in England and is mandated for use in Scotland by the Scottish Government Health Directorates as the preferred briefing and design system for NHS Scotland. See Mandatory Requirement 7 of this policy. It has been developed to assist in the construction, briefing development, design and alteration of healthcare facilities. Spaces designed using ADB data automatically comply with English planning guidance such as health building notes and health technical memoranda, as ADB forms an integral part of the English guidance publication process. While Scottish users can create their own project-specific briefs and designs using ADB's extensive library of integrated graphics and text, which includes room data sheets, room layouts, and departmental room schedules, extreme care should be taken to ensure that such data, such as Scottish Health Planning Notes, Scottish Health Facilities Notes, and Scottish Health Technical Memoranda, as published by Health Facilities Scotland. So just reading there, was one reason, or perhaps the reason for the use of ADB, that it meant automatic compliance with technical guidance, including HTMs?
Yes, I think, well, that was certainly the intent. The section in the paragraph that you've just read where it is recognised that there may be differences between the English guidance and the Scottish guidance, and that care should be taken to ensure that Scottish guidance was applied, but that was certainly the intent of the ADB. And again, having a consistent approach across NHS Scotland to that.
And prefacing this with an understanding that you're not a technical person or an engineer, is it the case that SHTMs often set very similar or identical standards to HTMs?
I can't answer for the detail of that. There'll be some standards that are generic, and some where there'll be statutory differences in Scotland that mean there has to be some deviation. So, but I can't comment on the detail of that, I'm afraid.
Okay. But was the expectation of the Scottish Government in setting this policy that the use of ADB would help ensure compliance with the Scottish standards?
That was certainly the aim, yes.
Yeah. And you referred there to the exhortation in the guidance, take extreme care to comply. Who was the guidance exhorting to take extreme care?
It would be the relevant NHS board or those that were preparing the relevant schedules.
And in that context, was the expectation of the policy still that the health board would use the ADB as the starting point for their briefing process?
Yes, as a mandatory requirement it would be.
If we go back to page 113, please. And just that passage we were looking at before, at paragraph 7, the part in square brackets, it says that if an alternative tool or approach is used, responsibility is placed on the NHS Scotland body to demonstrate that the alternative is of equal quality and value in its application. Would that include ensuring that the alternative was at least as good as the ADB in ensuring compliance with relevant technical guidance?
I would expect so, and for an NHS board to deviate from that, I would have also expected the relevant NHS body to have had appropriate arrangements for its own assurance in place.
Reading on to mandatory requirement number 8, there's a reference there to the Achieving Excellence in Design Evaluation Toolkit, or the AEDET. Are you able to explain what that is?
Not in detail, I'm afraid, with the passage of time, but it was a standard toolkit available to NHS boards to look at wider aspects of design quality.
So far as...
Go on.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you.
No, so it had a broader application than simply around any kind of technical standards.
I mean, do you know to what extent, if at all, it was concerned with compliance with technical guidance?
I honestly can't comment on the detail of that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Now, if we move to mandatory requirement number 9, under the heading of monitoring, SGHD will monitor the integration of design quality into healthcare building procurement through the business case approvals process, which will be facilitated through a coordinated assessment of the potential quality of proposed projects to support those responsible for decision-making within the business case process. This assessment will involve the contribution of particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to government policy on design and placemaking from Architecture and Design Scotland, and of particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to functionality, particularly technical and sustainability standards from Health Facilities Scotland. So we see there the mandatory requirement that design become a part of the business case approvals process.
Yes.
And is subject to monitoring by the Scottish Government through the business case approvals process.
Yes. So it would be part of the checklist, if you like, that would be assessed for any proposals coming forward.
Could we move forward, please, to page 131?
Sorry, could I just add a comment? So obviously the policy was updated in 2010. The revised version of the SCIM didn't come out until 2011. So there was a time gap between the two.
Okay.
Just to highlight.
Sorry, could I just make sure I've got that? The policy as expressed in the letter is 2010, and the SCIM document is 2011.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Baxter. You've very helpfully answered a question which was coming up, so
Sorry.
grateful to you.
Apologies.
If we could go, do you have page 131 in front of you?
Yep.
If not, could we please go to page 131?
I've got it in front of me.
We see there a section headed up Design Assessment. An assessment of design quality is now part of the SGHD business case process. All projects submitted to the SGHD Capital Investment Group for approval are now subject to an assessment of design quality and functionality, including technical and sustainability standards, and so on. That reflects the process we've been discussing this morning, I think.
Yes.
Then paragraph 2 there says there are 2 complementary areas of consideration in design of healthcare buildings. Then just reading on, these can broadly be described as healthcare-specific design aspects, the areas generally covered by guidance issued by Health Facilities Scotland, and then it goes on to discuss general good practice in design.
Yep. Yes.
And so on. There's a reference there to the tripartite working relationship that we discussed. That paragraph also refers to something called the NHS Scotland Design Assessment Group. It says that it reports to the CIG. What was the Design Assessment Group?
I have to say, with passage of time, the term itself, I don't recognise particularly, but there was engagement, including Scottish Government, Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland in advance of consideration of business cases. So I'm not sure if that's the reference to it, but it involved those three parties. Okay.
I mean, as far as you recall, was the Design Assessment Group a formally established group or anything like that?
Well, the process itself was part of the SCIM, and it was part of the design quality policy. So in terms of formalisation of it, it was a formal process.
If we could just move forward to page 133, please. Down at the bottom of that page, do you see a section headed up Role of the Client?
Yeah, I can see it now.
And the first sentence there, the key role of the client is to develop a clear, well-defined brief. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And then on to page 134, we have the second paragraph. As part of their responsibilities, the client must, then there's a long list of bullet points. Read the fourth bullet point. It says, client must allocate sufficient time and resources to establish the client's design quality aspirations and set out clear benchmarks which the client must reinforce through all stages of the process. Then reading on down to the 11th bullet, the client must establish clear and effective routes for communication between the client team and the bidding design team during the bidding process so that the board's needs and aspirations can be more fully discussed and incorporated into the designs that are brought forward. Are those things that the CIG would want to be satisfied about during the business case approval process?
I'm not sure there would be explicit questions that would be asked, but compliance with the policy more generally, I think, would be an assurance that would be sought. The engagement, particularly between the client team and bidders, would be something that would be evident from the procurement process and the reporting of the procurement process rather than a specific inquiry on that particular point.
Okay.
So just to understand that answer, you say it's not sure the capital investment group would ask, well,
The
ask
specific question.
Ask is my word. I'm not sure if it was your word, specific. And I take it that was reference to the various bullets.
Correct.
Thank
Correct.
you. Sorry, Mr.
Okay. And then the final bullet on that page, the client must not allow design time to be squeezed in order to recover time lost in the programme for other reasons. Good design takes time.
Yep.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Now, we've been discussing Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland in the context of this design policy. The policy also refers to the Scottish Futures Trust, and that's at page 122.
Yes, I've got that on screen.
Now, we can read what the guidance says for ourselves, but can you say what role, if any, the Scottish Futures Trust had under this policy in relation to design standards?
Not specifically in relation to design standards as such. The Scottish Futures Trust had a role, as they did with other parts of the public sector as part of the NPD programme, in satisfying themselves around the potential costs and scope of proposals coming forward. So the design review that was undertaken by SFT in relation to sick kids really had that aim in mind. It wasn't their function to test technical standards and the way that the NDAP process would have done.
Okay, just to be clear about that, I think I'm right in understanding you as contrasting two things. First of all, the checking of technical standards, which you say was not the SFT's role.
Correct.
And the second, I think, was satisfying themselves about scope and the cost of the proposal. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the proposals that have been developed, and if we take sick kids as an example, but it would apply to any MPD project, really to verify that in terms of the capacity that had been planned around the facility, that the scale of the facility and the capital cost of it was reasonable. Some of the parameters that would have been used around the basis of capital costs and hard and soft facilities management costs in terms of the financial modelling were things that they would have been particularly interested in.
So is it fair to put it this way, that the SFT's interest in design would be insofar as the design pertained to things like cost and value for money and so on.
That's my understanding. And in terms of the guidance that was set out in March 2011, the funding conditions, the role of SFT set out in that material.
Okay, that's another document that we will come to. Now, a moment ago, Mr. Baxter, you referred to the SCIM guidance on NDAP, I think, being introduced in 2011. Could we go, please, to Bundle 8, page 63? Is hopefully on screen you've got that document. Is that the document you were talking about?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Can you just explain what it is?
So this is the relevant part of the capital investment manual, which develops on the principles set out in the design quality policy. So essentially the guidance that NHS boards are due to follow.
Okay, and we see the heading there, supporting guidance, design assessment in the business case process. Yes. Is this essentially a guide on the NDAP process?
Yes.
And what was the reason for the passage of time between the 2010 policy and this document, which I think we can see from the front page is dated 5th of July 2011?
I can't recall the specifics of the reason for the time lag, but there will have been a number of issues that have been worked through in detail around the application of the process and respective roles within it.
Yes, so perhaps as simple as you need time to put the flesh on the bones of a new policy.
That's what I would expect, but as I say, I can't recall any specifics as to the reason for the delay.
Okay. Now, Lord Brodie, I'm about to embark on some questioning of this document. I note the time. It may be a convenient time to stop now before we...
Yes, we'll take our mid-morning break. It's about just after 25 past. If we could be back by quarter to 12.
Now, Mr Baxter, just before we broke, we had brought up on screen the Scottish Capital Investment Manual guidance on design assessment. Is that still on the screen in front of you?
It is indeed.
If we could go, please, to, I think it's page 64. I'm afraid my page numbering is different, but it should be headed up, Design Assessment in the Business Case Process, and then Introduction. Do you have that?
Yes.
Yep. And just to put this document into context, I'll read what it says. From the 1st July 2010, an assessment of design quality will become part of the business case approval process. This guidance should be viewed as part of the Scottish Capital Investment Manual, notified through CEL 19 of 2009. Now, the reference there to 1st July 2010, was that the date of the letter of the design policy that we
Yes, it
at?
was.
And it continues, this guidance describes how design standards should be established for projects, the board's role in assessing progress in achieving design standards, the design assessment process, and the submission requirements at each business case stage. And just to be clear, is the reference there to the board in the second bullet a reference to the health board?
Yes, it is.
And then if we could please move on to page 65. You see a heading there, Design Assessment in the Business Case Process, and then a subheading, Compliance with Healthcare Design Guidance. And just reading from the bottom paragraph, it says that accordingly, projects submitted to the Capital Investment Group for business case approval will be assessed for compliance with current published guidance. To facilitate this, boards will be requested to submit a comprehensive list of the guidance that they consider to be applicable to the development under consideration, see inset on next page, together with a schedule of derogations that are required for reasons specific to the project's particular circumstances. And then over the page, we see the table headed up. Projects submitted for the business case process will be assessed for compliance with the following. In section A, healthcare guidance, and amongst the guidance listed there, we see the Scottish Health Technical Memoranda issued by Health Facilities Scotland, and below it, Health Technical Memoranda issued by the Department of Health Estates in England. And it explains that where there is a current SHPN or SHTM relating to a subject, then it takes precedence over the equivalent HBN or HTM. Where there is no Scottish version of a document, the English document can be used. And then at paragraph C in the table, we have a list of other mandatory requirements, which include the BREEAM guidance and also the activity database. So do we understand the process described here is one in which the health board is to list the guidance which it thinks applies and identify any parts of that guidance from which it intends to derogate?
That's my reading of the guidance, yes.
What do you understand to be meant by derogations in this context?
My interpretation would be a deviation from the extant guidance.
And would that be a deviation or a departure intended by the health board?
Yes.
And this guidance says that the list of applicable guidance is to be accompanied by a schedule of derogations. What would you expect, or what information would you expect to be included in a schedule of derogations?
The nature of the derogation, an explanation as to why the derogation would be sought, and as I said in my written statement, I would have expected an NHS board to have undertaken a risk assessment as to any implications from any derogation.
And would you expect the schedule of derogations to include a report on that risk assessment?
I would expect it to be covered. Whether it's a report, I would certainly expect it to be covered.
Can I just try and ask you to be a little bit clearer about what you would expect when you say that you would expect it to be covered?
So I would expect an explanation as to why the derogation would be sought, what assessment had been undertaken to support such a derogation, and the outcome of that assessment.
Okay. And then picking up the text from the bottom of the table on page 66. The NHS Scotland design assessment process will then make an assessment of the design information available each business case stage for compliance with the guidance. Now, what did the CIG expect that assessment to entail?
So the way the design assessment process was set up, as we've covered, there were two elements to it. One was the health-specific guidance, and then there was some more general design aspects. So in terms of Health Facilities Scotland's involvement in that, I would have expected their expertise to have been applied in respect to the technical guidance, and for Architecture and Design Scotland's input to be more general in terms of their responsibilities.
And if we focus for the moment on HFS and the technical guidance, what design information did you expect them to be considering?
I can't answer the detail of that. I would expect that to be contingent on what was contained within the schedule and what information they would need to assess in order to satisfy themselves if there was a derogation, or indeed the list of standards that were covered in the submission.
Now, I appreciate, of course, that you weren't in HFS, you weren't responsible for the technical guidance, but this process was one of reporting to the CIG, and in that capacity, did you have an expectation of the depth or nature of the consideration being given to information by HFS?
I would expect it to be appropriate to the circumstances, and the text that you read out in the box that's contained above the passage that you've just read, whatever information was needed in order to satisfy themselves that those conditions had been met.
Would you regard that as a judgment to be made by HFS about what was appropriate, rather than one that you on the CIG could take?
Yeah, I'm not qualified to make such a judgment.
If we read forward onto page 67, please. Down at the bottom of that page, we have a heading, Referral to the NHS Scotland Design Assessment Process. And it reads that Health Facilities Scotland will provide support to boards in considering design matters in the business case process. Staff from HFS and Architecture and Design Scotland, supported as necessary by a broader panel, will have the following roles in relation to all projects that are to be assessed. The first bullet, to advise the project team if the standards or benchmarks and self-assessment process being established for the project are in line with policy objectives. Secondly, to provide an assessment of the design aspects of the project, support the board in their consideration of the business case, and to provide a verification to the capital investment process, CIG, of the opinion previously given to the board, support the CIG's consideration of the business case. The purpose of this resource is to provide support on matters relating to design policy and so on. The assessment considers the general areas of design being addressed by the project team as a high-level verification for the board and the CIG. As such, it should not be seen as a replacement for the project team's in-depth consideration of technical and other standards. The contrast there is between a high-level verification to be given by HFS and an in-depth consideration of technical and other standards to be done by the project team. Do you agree with that?
That's what the guidance says, yes.
Yep. And if the HFS verification doesn't achieve the same depth as the project team's consideration, what is it intended to achieve?
Well, bearing in mind that the section of the guidance that's been referred to is about the identification of any deviation or derogation from standard. So the extent to which that exists or doesn't exist will impact on the level of depth that's required and the nature of that derogation. I would expect so. I don't think it's possible to give a kind of blanket answer on that.
Okay. So the question of whether or not there's a derogation or a departure from guidance, is that something which the process expects to be identified by the Health Board itself?
Yes.
And I think what I understood you to say is that the depth of investigation by HFS would depend on the nature of the derogation and the circumstances surrounding it.
Yes, and the nature of the scheme, yes.
And what was it that the CIG expected to be verified by HFS?
I would have expected it to be that the submission by the board that any issues that had been identified had been addressed, or if there were any outstanding issues or issues of concern, that those would have been identified.
Would it include a verification about whether any proposed derogation was acceptable?
I don't think I can be definitive on that point. HFS are there to provide advice. They're not a decision-making body. But their advice as to whether there were issues would have been part of their report to CIG and indeed to the project, I would have expected.
Okay. Are you aware of what resources there were within HFS to carry out the NDAP?
Not specifically, but as part of the tripartite arrangement that was entered into, there was discussion with both HFS and with Architecture and Design Scotland around additional resources that would be required to support the process. I can't recall the specifics of that, but I remember there were discussions in terms of the funding that was made available to both organisations.
But if it was to be suggested that around that time there was only a single architect at HFS dealing with the NDAP process, would you be able to agree with that, or could you not say?
I couldn't confirm.
It's a matter of extreme detail, Mr. McLennan, but I think what we heard was that there was a single engineer as opposed to single architect.
Okay, well,
as I say, it's extreme detail.
I'm much obliged, my lord. Replacing architect with engineer, would your answer have been the same?
Yes, it would, and I can't comment on the extent to which HFS would have called on resources from within their overall establishment, depending on the nature of the expertise that was sought. So, I'm afraid I can't comment further.
Okay. If we could go, please, to page 69. We have a section in here, and you've alluded to this already, Mr. Baxter. Section 1.4, headed up Transitional Arrangements. And what it says is as follows: this guidance shall apply to all projects submitted for approval of the initial agreement after 1st July 2010. Projects that have not received approval of their outline business case by 1st July 2010 shall be considered for the assessment process on a case-by-case basis as part of the initial pilot phase, and so on. How did those transitional arrangements apply to the Sick Kids project?
The original outline business case for Sick Kids dated from 2008. There was an additional complication in terms of the change in funding mechanism for the project, and from a review, and again, given the passage of time, I can't recall the detail of it, but from a review of the outline business case that was submitted by NHS Lothian, there were a number of design review processes undertaken. Whether they would be classified as NDAP or an equivalent, I can't confirm, I'm afraid.
Okay, so if we were to ask whether the Sick Kids project, and by that I'm including within it the Department of Clinical Neurosciences, if we were to ask whether that project was subject to a mandatory NDAP or fell into the category for consideration on a case-by-case basis, can you remember which side of the line?
No, I can't. What I can recall is exchanges from material that I've been able to review where I'd sought to bring together HFS, Architecture and Design Scotland and Scottish Futures Trust around design review of the process of the project. But the nature of that, I'm afraid I can't provide any further detail on from the information I have had access to.
We'll have a look at some of the documents relating to that later on. Can I ask this, though? Whose decision was it on whether or not an NDAP was to take place?
In terms of the CIG process, that would have been largely down to myself in consultation with others.
Because the NDAP process is part of the business case review process.
Correct.
Being conducted by the CIG, and you at the time were the chair of the CIG.
That's correct.
Now, of course, Mr. Baxter, you left the Scottish Government or you left the Health Directorates in 2014.
Correct.
I understand that that this particular guidance was updated in 2017, which is some time after you left. Are you aware of any change in relation to this guidance that happened in 2017?
No, and no, I'm not party to that.
Okay. And during the time that you were in the Scottish Government, was there any proposal under consideration or discussion to make NDAP a compulsory process for all projects and to remove the transitional provision?
Well, the transitional provision at the time related to the stage of approval at the point of the introduction of the design quality policy on the 1st of July 2010. So by the nature of developments, new projects coming forward, I would have expected to be subject to the NDAP as an extant part of the scheme and the design quality policy. So there would be a natural transition out for older projects.
Yes. So eventually you would reach a point where all of the pre-2010 projects had gone through the system.
Correct.
And any new project would thereby be subject to the NDAP.
Correct.
And a moment ago, I think I'm right in saying that you described HFS as having an advisory role in the NDAP. Am I correct in recalling that?
Well, they were providing expert advice. So,
could you look, please, at page 70 of the bundle? And we've got a flow chart there, and the passage of text above it says, the NHS Scotland design assessment process for all projects over the delegated value sits in an advisory role to decision makers in both the commissioning board and the capital investment group within the Scottish Government Health Directorate. Although the process is described there as advisory, is it correct that it would be open to the CIG to recommend refusal of approval if dissatisfied with the findings of an NDAP?
yes.
You go, please, to page 72. And we have a heading halfway down the page, Response by NHS Scotland Design Assessment Process to the Board. And again, just to be clear, does board there refer to the Health Board?
Yes.
And reading from that, the outcome of the assessment will be encapsulated in a brief report to cover the following areas. And then we have joint statement of support and then a list of options. The list of options is divided into two. First of all, supported, And then over the page, we see unsupported. Is this a reference to a report by HFS and Architecture Design Scotland to the Health Board?
Yes, it would be.
And do we see there that the conclusions of the report are either to be that the project is supported or it is unsupported?
Yes.
And in relation to the supported option, we see that it says that it may include recommendations as follows. Essential recommendations, those areas requiring amendment or alteration in order to meet either national guidance or something else. And then if we move from there over the page to what it says about something being unsupported, it's on page 73. This will include a statement of the areas of concern that leads the panel to consider the project is likely to fall seriously short of either the benchmarks set by the board, standards established for healthcare buildings, or the expectations established in national policy. So just in short, would it be your understanding or your expectation of the report emerging from the NDAP process to the Health Board that insofar as it identified a departure from national guidance, the two options would be either that the project be unsupported or that it be supported with an essential recommendation to comply with the guidance?
That would be my expectation, yes.
And if we move further down page 73, there's a section headed Interaction with Capital Investment Process Considerations. And reading from that, HFS will notify the CIG when the process is completed and verify to the CIG the recommendation given to the board. The submission sent by the board to the capital investment process should include the information set previously to the NHS Scotland design assessment process and the response received. In considering the business case, the CIG will take the NDAP's response into consideration as follows. Then there's a list of bullets. If it's supported with no qualifications, the CIG can approve. If it's supported with essential or advisory recommendations, evidence of how the identified issue is being addressed will be required prior to CIG approval. And then unsupported, CIG will not approve. So do we see there that according to this guidance, the CIG would not approve a project insofar as the NDAP had identified departures from national guidance?
That's correct. Where they've been identified in the NDAP process, yes. Sorry, if I could make another comment, which I hope will be helpful. So the NDAP reports provided to the project, and in those cases where supported with recommendations, there would be an opportunity for the project, or unsupported, there would be an opportunity for the project to address those issues. So the sequencing of that relative to a business case being submitted to the CIG may vary. So if the design assessment process was undertaken at an early enough stage, then there was the opportunity for the NHS board to address the issues and for the NDAP essentially to be updated to reflect that.
Yes. And one can imagine a process in which departures are identified and the health board given an opportunity to remedy that, so that they're then in a position to submit a compliant business case.
Correct.
Yeah. I think you agreed earlier that the NDAP process happens at each of the three main stages of business case approval.
For those projects commenced after, or for initial agreements after 1st of July 2010, that should have been the case.
Yes. And if we just go forward, please, to page 75, we see this is headed up Appendix A, NDAP submission requirements. And it states that below are the anticipated submission requirements at key reporting points. And we see then some grey headings denoting the three business case approval stages.
Yes.
The second of which is outline business case. And we see there, it says stage early in the OBC process, an informal consultation on site selection, strategic briefing considering, and then the bullets below it include one which says list of relevant design guidance to be followed, including SHTMs and activity database, and also evidence that activity database will be fully utilised during the preparation of the brief and throughout the design and commissioning process. So do we see there the expectation that in the NDAP process, for those projects to which it applies, the Health Board is to produce that list of guidance and evidence that the activity database is going to be used during the preparation of the brief?
Yes.
And then below that, we've got stage late in the development of the OBC, when the design is becoming formed but is still open to influence. And reading over the page to page 76, we see the list of submission requirements. And the bottom two, evidence that activity database is being fully utilised during the preparation of the brief, so on. And an updated list of relevant design guidance to be followed, and any schedule of derogations in relation to these. Was that your understanding of what was expected of a health board at these stages of the NDAP process?
It seems entirely logical on the basis of how projects are developed and the level of detail that exists at each stage of the business case process.
And if we go, please, to page 77, we see the same sort of list of details for the full business case stage. And again, the list of bullets includes an updated list of relevant design guidance to be followed and any schedule of derogations, and evidence of the activity database being fully utilised. So the Health Board is required by this policy to provide that information at the full business case stage 2.
Yes.
And then finally, if we just go over to page 78, we have a list of information to be provided for NPD schemes. And do we see there that the information to be submitted to for the NDAP process includes the design proposals from the preferred bidder?
Yes.
And as I think, out of fairness to you, what you've been keen to emphasise is that these are the requirements for those projects which are subject to the 2010 version of the NDAP.
That's correct.
Now, I think we've probably covered this, but we could just put it in terms of a concrete example. If a health board which was subject to this process decided not to use the activity database data when briefing or designing a new hospital, what would you expect it to do?
As the 2010 policy states in the mandatory requirements, if there's an alternative, it should have equivalent use and value. I think the question for me is about the board receiving the necessary assurances through whatever process it decides to apply, and essentially a justification as to why it's deviating from accepted practice.
And specifically in the NDAP process, is that information that you would expect them to give to HFS for consideration by HFS?
Well, the source information that HFS would need would still be the same. If not provided through the activity database, then it would equivalent information would have been required through another source.
And again, in concrete terms, if the Health Board had decided not to use the activity database, but did not raise that through the NDAP process, in other words, didn't include it in its list of derogations, is that non-use of the activity database something that you would expect the NDAP process to detect?
Yes, because the source information that's required in order to conduct the NDAP would be dependent on equivalent information from the ADB or an equivalent.
Okay. Were the 2010 design policy and these NDAP procedures intended to apply to both capital funded and NPD funded projects?
Yes, and the extract that you've just referred to highlights the differentiation for NDP projects given the nature of the procurement and design.
Of course it does. If I'd remembered that, I might not have had to ask that question. Sorry. I'd like, if I may, now to turn to issues more specifically related to the Sick Kids project at Little France. And again, just for clarity, I include the Department of Clinical Neurosciences. Prior to 2010, the plan, or at least the expectation, was that both of these would be funded by public capital. Is that right?
So the funding for Sick Kids was included within the capital programme. As I covered in my witness statement, the funding for DCN, or Department of Clinical Neurosciences, was less clear given existing funding commitments within the NHS Scotland capital programme.
As far as you know, was it the Health Board's hope or expectation that it would be a capital funded project?
Yes.
And as it transpired, neither was funded in that way. Why was that?
At the end of 2009, or late 2009, the UK spending review concluded, and there was a significant reduction in capital funding available to the Scottish Government. And from memory, I think it was about 36.5% reduction in real terms in capital. At that time, there were significant legal commitments, so contracts had already been entered into, which placed quite a call on available capital resources. At the time, the Scottish Government wanted to maintain capital investment, or investment in public facilities, as a means of stimulating the economy, as well as replacement of ageing public sector facilities, including hospitals, schools, etc. So the budget that was announced in late 2010, the announcement was made that Sick Kids would be delivered through NPD.
And so, just to put this in a kind of wider timeline, were these budgetary decisions being taken in the context or the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008?
Yes, they were.
And it was decided around this time that the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow, and I think also what became the Queensferry Crossing, would continue to be capital funded. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And whose decision was that?
That was a decision taken by Scottish ministers on the basis of advice that they received.
And why were those particular projects capital funded and not the Sick Kids?
So the nature of the two projects, for Queensferry Crossing, which I was involved in a later role, that had already proceeded to procurement at the point. So there were contractual commitments that related to that. In terms of the Queen Elizabeth, the accounting rules that pertained at the time, and how the expenditure scored against the Health Board's budget, there would have been significant affordability challenges with delivering that through non-profit distributing, or PPP, at the time. In addition, there were interfaces with existing hospital estate ageing hospital estate, which changes the risk profile. So there were a range of factors that were taken into account at the time.
Okay. Now, NPD is a variant of PFI, is that correct?
It's a variant, yes.
Why did NPD come about in Scotland?
So one of the criticisms of early PFI schemes, and not just in Scotland but across the UK, was around uncapped returns to the private sector. Because of the nature of how those projects were funded, there was a combination of senior debt from banks, mezzanine debt, which was provided by funders, which attracted a higher rate of interest, and then share capital. And effectively, the share capital provided an opportunity for uncapped returns. So the NPD model was developed with the aim of capping returns to the private sector and delivering better value for money.
So with that explanation, to what extent is an NPD model different from a PFI model, and to what extent is it the same?
It's largely the same in the sense that it's a project finance arrangement, but the debt structure is quite different. So there's debt from funders through senior debt and mezzanine debt, but there is no share capital. And by doing that, effectively you cap the interest that's payable through the NPD model.
Could we have a look, please, at Bundle 7, page 51.
Cool.
Do we see there, Mr. Baxter, this is a document, again, with the Scottish Government crest, headed Scotland Spending Plans and Draft Budget 2011-2012.
Yes, I've got that on screen.
Is this a document you're familiar with?
In general terms, given passage of time, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And was this the document which announced the switch to NPD funding for the Sick Kids Hospital?
My understanding is it would have been yes.
If we could go, please, to page 101, that. Now, there's obviously a lot of discussion within this document about which projects are to be done by NPD and so on. Just at the top of page 101, it says that this new pipeline of NPD projects, which, to be clear, includes the sick kids, is being targeted to provide the maximum support for the wider capital programme and for Scotland's key public services. The Scottish Government will seek to deliver each project as early as possible in order to accelerate its benefits to citizens and to the wider economy. It's those words, as early as possible, that I'm interested in. Do you recall a desire to bring these projects on as early as possible?
Yes.
And what was the reason for that?
There was the need for the projects had already been identified, so it was about trying to minimise any delay in the delivery of those projects, which would have been at different stages of development. Some would have been, at the very early planning stages. Others would have been in procurement, as was the case for sick kids.
Were there risks for those projects if the pace was too fast?
I don't think that the risk being too fast was a consideration. It was really about making sure that the projects were planned appropriately and resourced appropriately to deliver what they needed to deliver. And as I say, a range of projects across the public sector would have been in different stages of development at that point that the decision was taken.
And did the switch of funding model from capital to NPD delay progress of the Sick Kids Hospital?
Compared to a Framework Scotland procured project funded by public capital, yes, there would have been a delay. I think what it is difficult to determine is that in the normal course of delivering a major capital project such as sick kids, is to what the exact impact of MPD as opposed to other factors would have been in the overall delivery timetable.
Okay, the budget announcement also said that the Scottish Futures Trust would take forward the NPD programme of investment. And we don't need to go to it, but the page reference is page 56. Prior to that point, had the SFT had a role in relation to the development of new hospitals in Scotland?
Yes, in respect of PPP projects, they had involvement in a range of projects, including Dumfries and Galloway, Royal Infirmary. So yes, they had involvement and had oversight in relation to the standard contract that was applied for PPP and then NPD thereafter.
And you referred there to their involvement in PPP. Had the SFT had any involvement prior to the budget announcement in relation to the Sick Kids Hospital?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
To what extent did the budget announcement and the SFT's role in relation to this programme of NPD investment, to what extent did that herald a change in the scale or nature of the SFT's role?
Well, the fact that it became an NPD project, SFT had a clear and defined role, but simply because of that, rather than a general interest in terms of capital investment. And they did have a general interest in terms of capital investment across Scotland, and procurement methodologies and issues like that.
And taking the £2.5 billion NPD programme in and of itself, did that represent a big increase in the workload of the SFT?
It would have done. There were existing programmes in play, particularly around schools, housing, alternative financing methods, such as the TIF. I'm trying to remember the acronym now, but they were involved in a range of things related to promotion of capital investment in Scotland.
What consideration was given before the budget announcement to the suitability of the Sick Kids project for NPD funding?
So there were a range of factors. Again, I covered some of this in my written statement. If you look at the characteristics that make a project suitable for the use of private finance, typically they would be associated with larger projects, with new build projects, where there had been essentially a track record of delivering within a particular sector. So those were probably the kind of key considerations at the time. Also, public capital is more suited to dealing with existing infrastructure. And at the time, we were aware of a significant backlog in terms of maintenance within the estate of the NHS in Scotland. So the consideration was partly about making maximum use of public capital for those things that it was most suited for, and complementing that with the use of other mechanisms such as MPD in order to maximise investment.
Sorry, entirely my fault. In answering the question as to whether the consideration was given as to the suitability of Sick Kids project for the NPD model, you said a range of factors, and you gave the example of NPD being more suitable for larger projects, new build projects, and then made a reference to track record. I just didn't get the rest.
So the point I was making was that private finance had been used in the health sector, so hospitals had been developed and delivered using private finance.
Thank you.
If the NPD funding route had not been available, could the Scottish Government have funded the Sick Kids?
In my opinion, no.
Were there any other funding options that you were aware of?
No.
And so far as you're aware, was NHS Lothian consulted before the budget announcement about their project being funded by NPD?
No,
And why was that?
it was part of the budget statement. Therefore, there were issues around parliamentary privilege. So that's my understanding as to why there wasn't involvement.
And if NHS Lothian had for any reason been uncomfortable about funding the project through private finance, what options did they have?
They wouldn't have been able to progress with the project if they'd not wished to do that.
Okay. And as it happens, they did in fact decide to proceed using the NPD model.
Yes.
Before the budget announcement was made, had NHS Lothian made significant progress towards procuring the sick kids as a capital funded design and build project?
Yes. So BAM had been appointed through the Framework Scotland national construction framework that was put in place. And we're developing the design and clinical models around the sick kids.
And just briefly, can you explain what the Framework Scotland model is?
So it's a national framework available to NHS boards to support capital expenditure. It's based on a standard set of contractual terms and conditions, the NEC 3 form of contract. It was developed for Scotland, led by Health Facilities Scotland, but supported by Scottish Government, and it was based on an existing mechanism called Procure 21 that was developed in England. The aim of Framework Scotland was to ensure that there was greater consistency in terms of how capital investment was undertaken, or capital procurement was undertaken, and ensure that because of the mechanisms within the contract, that there was greater certainty on cost and time delivery.
And what impact did the change in funding model have on the procurement of the Sick Kids Hospital?
Effectively, the existing procurement through Framework Scotland would have to be halted and a new procurement undertaken.
Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 1, page 1120?
I can see that.
Is that a document you recognise?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us what it is, please?
It's a briefing on the issues associated with the change in funding for sick kids.
Okay. And I think this was a briefing that you drafted.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think you say in your statement that it was a briefing drafted ultimately for the First Minister's benefit. Is that? That's
correct.
Yep. We see it headed up, Royal Hospital for Sick Children, delay in delivery through revenue finance.
Yep.
And the document itself is undated, but in your statement you describe it as being dated the 16th of November 2010. So that's quite shortly after the budget announcement.
Yes.
If we go to page 1121, please, just at the bottom. Just reading from there, it says, the Capital Investment Group approved the outline business case on 15 August 2008, which allowed NHS Lothian to proceed with its preferred option to develop the new hospital on the Little France site using public capital, supported by university and endowment funding. A preferred bidder, BAM Construction, was appointed from the NHS Scotland National Framework Scotland, on 30th of April 2009. I think that's just confirming what you explained a moment ago. And if we move over the page to 1122, you say there, a full business case is being prepared by the NHS board and was scheduled to be considered by the Capital Investment Group in January 2011, following completion of design and costing work with the construction partner. Even with a change in funding route, it would be sensible to conclude detailed design work, sign-off for which is expected by the end of November 2010. So do we see there just how far down the route NHS Lothian had got with the Framework Scotland procurement route?
Yes.
They were just 2 or 3 months away from submitting the full business case.
I think I've said there was scheduled to be considered by the CIG in January 2011, but that would be dependent on NHS Lothian closing out those issues that are highlighted with their partner.
Okay, thank you. And you talk there about completion of design and costing work with the construction partner. I presume that's BAM.
Correct.
Could you please expand on your understanding of that?
So the Framework Scotland approach is essentially 2 stages where you engage with a principal supply chain partner, in this case BAM, to develop up proposals to such a stage where you have a target cost based on a detailed design, and then proceed to submit your outline business case based on that, and then proceed to your detailed design with the principal supply chain partner prior to a full business case.
So what was your understanding of the stage of advancement reached by the design prepared by BAM?
In terms of the detail of the design at that point, I honestly can't comment on that, but they had been engaged for some period of time. What I was well aware of was the level of input from across NHS Lothian in terms of the development of the clinical model, and the extent to which that had been developed prior to the decision to change the funding mechanism.
And what you say in this briefing document is that it would be sensible to conclude detailed design work.
Yep.
Was that your view?
Yes, it was. What we're talking, if we think about the level of design work that had been conducted to that point, the spatial arrangements had been essentially set based around a clinical model and service model, but the technical design work was still required to be done at that point. So, you know, the example that's been referred to a number of times around ventilation and things like that wouldn't have been developed at that point in time.
Okay.
It's my understanding.
And why was it your view that it would be sensible to conclude the detailed design work?
Because if we hadn't have done that, or we hadn't agreed to that, they would have had to start again. So the work that had been done by BAM in engaging with the board around what their service model was, what the building needed to do, essentially would have been wasted. And the impact of that in terms of cost, but also the significant energy that had been put into this and commitment that had been put into it by the NHS board would have been lost as well.
And just reading down page 1122 to the final paragraph, you say that in moving to an NPD finance route, the current procurement will require to be halted and a new procurement commenced as soon as possible. Scottish Futures Trust have been requested to prepare a proposal due within the next 2 days on how it could support NHS Lothian to develop an NPD procurement strategy as soon as possible. SFT have been given a clear brief to develop a proposal and strategy that minimises any delay in the delivery of the project. It's expected that with appropriate input from both SFT and NHS Lothian, that a new procurement strategy could be ready within 4 to 6 weeks. Can you just explain why a new procurement was needed?
So the Framework Scotland contractual arrangements didn't allow for the use of private finance. Those were for public capital projects. And in order, so there'd been a significant change in the nature of the project effectively. So therefore, from a procurement perspective, we would need to at the time use competitive dialogue as a basis for securing a contractor.
And why was the SFT being asked to support NHSL? Because
they had expertise that, you know, in Scottish terms, they were the experts in terms of the application of private finance, both from a commercial perspective, but also in terms of their engagement across a variety of sectors in the planning and delivery of such projects.
And was that expertise that NHSL didn't have at that time?
Correct. or it would certainly supplement what experience and expertise they had, bearing in mind that they had an existing PFI contract.
Can we go to Bundle 3, Volume 1, page 1107, please? And if you have that on screen, Mr. Baxter.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we see there an exchange of emails between you and Peter Reiki? You see that?
Yes.
And who was Peter Reiki?
At the time, Peter was the director, as it says, for finance and structures within SFT. Peter had significant experience in PFI-related matters in both this role and previous roles, and is now the Chief Executive of Scottish Futures Trust.
Okay, and just reading from your email down there, and this is just to put the document we're about to look at into context. You say, Pete, do you have the proposal we discussed last week? Following on from my meeting with Barry this afternoon, I want to be clear prior to tomorrow's meeting on the basis of your engagement with them, what we expect of Lothian over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And then Peter Reiki replies saying, in confidence for our discussion, and he attaches a paper. So if we could go please to page 1111, see the, I hope, the paper.
I can see that.
Is that the paper that Mr. Reiki sent you?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. If you just read from paragraph 1 of that, it says, Introduction. Following the announcement that the sick kids in DCN are to be delivered as revenue finance projects under the NPD structure, this note sets out for discussion thoughts on the potential way forward. It's based on SFT's current understanding of the project scope and status. And then scope, project scope as an NPD and affordability need to be considered together. Can you explain that point being made by Mr. Reiki?
Yeah, so essentially the costs of an NPD project are largely driven by the scale of the capital investment and the asset to be maintained over the life of the contract. So the project scope effectively determines that. So not, the size of it and the nature of it would determine the capital investment figure that then required to be supported by debt. So that's the link between affordability and scope.
Okay, and so what was the SFT's interest in scope? Why were they interested in the scope of the build?
At the point of this exchange, the announcement had just been made, and the estimate that's included there at 250 million was at that point the current estimate of the costs of sick kids, and that needed to be tested. Within the government at the time, the overall pipeline of 2.5 billion across all sectors, the affordability of that had been considered as part of that decision. Therefore, if the costs had increased from 250 million, then the financial consequences obviously were going to increase. So, the scope and affordability was an important consideration just in terms of living within the means that had been set out.
Okay. And if we move on to page 1112, and reading paragraph 4, which is headed Interface with Existing Sick Kids Procurement, there will need to be rapid consideration by NHSL and its advisors of the exit from the current NHS framework contract. It may be beneficial to transfer elements of design work undertaken to the new procurement. SFT is not involved in the framework and cannot really advise in this area. And then section 5, headed Preparing for Procurement. Consideration will be needed at an early stage of how much the design should be progressed in-house and how much in competition through the NPD procurement. There's an opportunity with recent accounting rules changes to undertake more design, especially overall massing, adjacencies, and even layouts in-house, with the preferred bidder taking on detailed design for construction. What was the SFT's interest in those aspects of the design?
So in terms of the paragraph 5A, those would be extremely helpful in verification of the overall capital cost, the reasonableness of the capital cost of the scheme.
So it goes back to the point we discussed a moment ago.
Sorry, could you just clarify? So
Well, you were explaining a moment ago the nature of the SFT's interest in the capital costs of the hospital.
yeah,
Was it in assessing the financial implications of the PFI project
Yes.
overall? Yeah, that's a related point.
yes.
And if we just go to page 1113, paragraph 6B, you see there NHS Lothian will need appropriate advisory support, financial, technical and legal, to bring forward a complex NPD procurement. And that's recognition by the SFT, I assume, of the point that you were making a moment ago.
Yes.
Is the procurement of an NPD project a more complicated exercise than doing it through the Framework Scotland?
Yes, it would be.
And in broad terms, why would that be?
I suppose three things that I would highlight. One, because of the financing of this, are the difference in financing, then it requires a different procurement structure. So funders, contractors. The second would be that what you're procuring through an NPD isn't simply the building, but you're procuring the hard FM services, so the maintenance services part of that. And the third is simply because of the nature of the ongoing relationship, if you like. So the nature of the contract is very different than build a building and then it's over to the board in terms of how it manages it.
Yeah, just give us a rough indication. What's the duration of an NPD
So
project agreement?
typically you'd be looking at 30 plus years.
If we could go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2 at page 314. This, Mr. Baxter, is a paper for the NHS Lothian, for the Finance and Performance Review Committee of the NHS Lothian Board, dated the 12th of January 2011. We don't need to look at it, but at page 322 we can see that the paper has been prepared by Susan Goldsmith, the Director of Finance at NHSL,
Yes.
Jackie Sainsbury, the Chief Operating Officer. Is this a paper you've seen before?
Yes, I have.
Was that in the context of preparing for this, or
Yes.
had you seen it before that?
And not to my knowledge.
And just to put it in context, if we read from paragraph 1.1, the purpose of this report is to provide the Finance and Performance Review Committee with an overview of the progress made over recent weeks to review the Royal Hospital for Sick Children Department of Clinical Neurosciences reprovision projects following the Scottish Government announcement on 17 November 2010 that these projects would be funded under the non-profit distributing model. And then in section 2, headed recommendations, it provides that the committee is invited to do various things, the second of which is approve progressing with a detailed reference design for a combined project as a key component of the NPD procurement route. And if we could just go to 4.3, please. And what's being set out here for the committee is the key features of the current NPD model. And they are said to include, first of all, traditional benefits of PPP with regard to risk transfer. Now, would you agree that that was a key feature of the NPD model?
Yes.
And what would you understand to be meant by the traditional benefits of PPP with regard to risk transfer?
Typically, construction risk, so cost and time overrun on construction would fall to the private sector in taking on those risks. If the payment mechanism for PPP projects is based on utilisation of facilities, so if the facility was underutilised, the demand risk, if you like, would sit with the private sector. So those were long established principles.
And what about design risk?
That design risk should rest with the private sector.
And if we go to 4.4, please, it says that the Scottish Futures Trust is to take a central role in the capital infrastructure programme across Scotland and will provide advice and guidance on all NPD projects, of which a pipeline of projects is now anticipated. One of the key matters to be clarified is the explicit roles and responsibilities of SFT and the distinct board-appointed technical, legal and/or financial advisors. Was that a fair comment at the time?
Yes, and it was still to be clarified. The subsequent guidance that was issued in March of 2011 kind of crystallised that in terms of what SFT's role would be, and bearing in mind that that's not simply in relation to sick kids, but in relation to the overall NPD programme.
Okay. And was there a need in relation to the sick kids project to distinguish in particular the role of the SFT from the role of technical advisors to be appointed by NHSL?
Yes, in terms of account, so SFT had a role in terms of supporting Scottish Government with an overview of the NPD programme, but the accountability of technical advisors was to the NHS board, in my view, so the detailed technical advice that was received by the board should have been through their advisors and not through SFT.
And what we see here is the board at this point in time, so January 2011, recognising that that was something that still needed to be sorted out.
Yes, and as I said in my last comment, obviously we were still working through the detail of this, not just in health, but in terms of how this would apply across the broader public sector. So the guidance that was issued in March of 2011 brought together the position on all of these matters.
And if we go to paragraph 6.1, which is at page 318, what's said here in this paper is, we have an objective to minimise both the delay to the programme, also the Cabinet Secretary's aspiration, and the abortive and ongoing costs. So do we see there that NHSL shared the aspiration of the Cabinet Secretary to make progress with the project?
Absolutely.
And was that your recollection at the time?
Yes.
And then if we go on to paragraph 6.2, it reads as follows. To achieve this, we've explored the procurement options with both SFT and SGHD for an NPD model, deliver the RHSC and DCN, with our ideal being to have utilised the existing design team, complete the design process, build on the market testing of packages already undertaken, and construct the new building, option 2 below. And then if we go down to option 2, utilising the PSPC, I think that's the role that BAM had.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yep. And Framework Scotland, with NPD wrapped around onto the contract. This option essentially novates the BAM contract to a newly procured SPV, which would then deliver the construction. So, in short, was it NHSL's preference to have the design finished and the hospital built by the contractors they'd already engaged?
I'm sure, well, I can't comment on if that was their preference, but it wasn't possible given the nature of the Framework Scotland contract and the nature of an NPD contract. So it's identified in the paper as an option, but I'm not sure from my experience that that's actually deliverable.
Okay, and can you just explain why that wouldn't be deliverable?
Because the contract that was entered into around the development of the facility was for the build only. It didn't cover the hard FM, so there would have been issues around balance sheet treatment, etc. For that as an NPD project.
And you referred there to the hard FM, but would the NPD model also involve financing arrangements?
Sorry. Yes, absolutely.
And was that another reason why the Framework Scotland procurement route wasn't suitable for this project?
Well, the Framework Scotland is based on public capital and the provision of effectively cash from government to boards to fund that investment.
And then if we go to 6.4 on page 320, it says that a review meeting including SFT, SGHD and McRoberts, consider options 2 and 3, took place on the 23rd of December. Following consideration of the issues and advice received to date, it has now been concluded that the recognised route for NPD procure is to take a reference design to the market, i.e. option 3. And then if we just go up above page 319, you see that option 3 is set out. Just reading there, continue to work through the framework contract to complete a reference design for the combined build for an open SPV procurement, pick up and then deliver construction, operation, etc. This has the attraction of market testing the NPD and has emerged as the balanced answer. Was that the approach supported by both the SFT and the Scottish Government?
Yes, I believe so.
And why did the SFT and the Scottish Government support a reference design approach?
Because it recognised the value of the work that had been undertaken around design to that point. The fact that the reference design would take design to such a stage that wouldn't compromise the NPD procurement, and the alternative would have been gone back to the drawing board. So it was a compromise option that was one compliant, but also sought to minimise delay and maximise the value of the work that had been done to that point.
Okay. And if we go to paragraph 7.3 at page 321, it says, we will continue to work with both SFT and SGHD to agree the appropriate procurement approach. However, one of the key pieces of advice from SFT and other parties is to ensure the support of appropriately experienced team and technical advisors at an early stage. This is also essential for the development of the reference design. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And why was experience needed in particular for development of the reference design?
Just reading the paragraph again, sorry. Yeah, so the interface between an NHS board and bidders during an NPD procurement is different than it would have been through Framework Scotland. So, and also I think just given the complexity of the project, the building, and what it was there to do, it was important that appropriate technical advisors were on board and could support the board through what they needed to do and what they should have expected and could have expected from bidders at each stage of the process. So the earlier you get them on board, the better.
Okay, and is it correct that a reference design approach includes specifying elements which it was mandatory for bidders to comply with?
Yes.
I note the time, my lord, maybe that's an appropriate point to break for lunch.
Yes. We'll take our lunch break now, about an hour, Mr. Baxter. So if you could be back for 2 o'clock, I'd be very grateful. I would be equally grateful if everyone else was back.